Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Farmhouse 2. The photograph on the right was a reference for my painting. And one of the challenges when working with a subject like this, where you have this farmhouse, which is all white and a very flat subject matter, very flat image, is to paint this in a way that it still has some interest and some depth and dimension to it. As I work on this, notice how value placement and the use of warm and cool colors are key factors in achieving this. For this painting, I'm working on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press Lanaquarel watercolor paper. It's 11 inches by 15 inches. I've taped the dry piece of paper to a piece of gator board using masking tape. I haven't soaked it or prepared it in any way. For most of my painting, I'll be working wet on dry, however there will be some points where I'll be working wet into wet. I've drawn a light sketch using a B pencil with the major shapes and some level of detail in it. Midway through my painting process, I'll use a kneaded rubber eraser or a soft rubber eraser to remove most of the pencil marks. They won't all come off, but that doesn't bother me. Before I begin painting, I'm going to discuss my palette a little bit. This is something I get asked about frequently. I'm working with a ceramic palette that has a number of wells in it, and I keep my wells full of pigment, and I use the mixing areas in the center of my palette. And because it's ceramic, it cleans up very easily. Just with water, it doesn't stain like some of the plastic palettes, but it is fragile. I tend to mix big pools of color on my palette, and I'll clean it frequently through my painting process. I know some people don't clean their palette for literally years, and in my opinion of that is you have to do what works best for you and what you're comfortable with. I like to continually work with a clean mixing area, so I clean mine frequently and mix large pools of color. In this photo, I have the majority of colors that I'll be using for this painting. The only exception is I don't have my greens here at this moment. So in the bottom right, I have Payne's gray. On the top right, I have cobalt blue. The bottom left, I have raw sienna. And on the top left, I have burnt sienna. The majority of painting will be done with a raw sienna, Payne's gray, and I'll use some accents of cobalt blue and burnt sienna. The neutral mixtures you see on the palette are combinations of Payne's gray with raw sienna or Payne's gray with burnt sienna, or cobalt blue with raw sienna or burnt sienna. At the point I took this photograph, you can see that this is a fairly fluid mixture of paint that I have with quite a bit of water, and it can be used to put down a middle value or light value wash, and I can go the full gamut here from a warm raw sienna to a cool Payne's gray or a neutral mixture, just using what I have on the palette. When I begin working with some of the greens, I'll clean my mixing area and start working with sap green, pyro red, raw sienna, and Payne's gray. As I begin this painting, I'm going to start by putting down middle value washes across the whole composition. One of the things I want to do is establish the lighting in my painting, the path of light through the composition. So I'm going to begin with a middle to light middle value wash, and I'm going to put it over the areas that I want to tone down with a middle or darker value. Some of these areas I put a middle value down initially, but I'll be coming back with a darker value later. But I want to start to show where the whites and lights are going to be in the painting. So I'll use this middle value wash to describe larger shapes of value that will help establish my composition and a pattern of light. As I work through these washes, I'll be using a combination of Payne's gray and raw sienna with a little bit of burnt sienna and cobalt blue put in at times. And you can see that I'm handling this as one wash, even though there's many features on the structure. I'm following the value pattern, not so much the components that make up the house, such as the window or the roof or the boards, individual boards. While I'm describing them by painting the shapes of value. So this side of the building, even though it has a window and boards, my interest in the wash that I'm putting down is describing that shape of value that helps, again, establish the pattern of light through my composition. As I mentioned, I'm working with Payne's Gray in this painting, and I currently have two brands. I have a Winsor Newton and a Daniel Smith. I happen to be using the Winsor Newton for this painting, and the Winsor Newton has a much more of a blue tint than the Daniel Smith that I have. So I just say that just so you're aware. As I say, I'm using Payne's Gray. It is a brand that happens to have quite a bit of a blue tint to it. So depending on what you have, you just have to experiment and use the one that works best for you. Keep in mind, as I put this middle value wash down, that once this dries, it's going to dry lighter. So what appears as a solid middle value wash as I'm putting it down wet is going to come across probably more as a light middle value once it's completely dry. I'm working with a fairly small general purpose sable brush right now, and I could be using a larger brush. I could be using a 1-inch flat brush actually to do this, and often I do. However, in this particular painting, I want to randomly put in some charges of warm and cool colors, and there's a little bit of intricacy in some of the small shapes, so I've decided to go with a smaller brush. But I could do this just as easily with a larger, say a flat brush, a 1/2 inch or even a 1-inch brush. Here I'm going to continue with my middle value wash, defining larger areas of value to help establish patterns of light in my composition. So I'm working on the plane that is the wall that's underneath the roof of this structure, and it's going to be completely in shadow. So I'm using a middle value wash of Payne's Gray and raw sienna to define that shape. And just as I did up above, I'm not really concerned with the features of the building at this point. There's a window there and textures and different things that are happening on the wall, but I'm more interested in defining that shape as a middle value than I am trying to detail the features of the structure at this point. I'm continuing to paint with this value on this same plane, but the shape is broken up by the positive shapes of the posts. And by working off the negative edge of those posts, I'm starting to define the posts without actually painting them. So here we have a positive negative relationship between the middle value shape that I'm painting and the positive forward shape, overlapping shape of the post. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned value placement and the use of warm and cool colors to help establish dimension. This is an example where in these two shapes where I'm working on this plane, I'm using a middle value to help differentiate that overall shape from the positive shapes of the posts, which starts to build depth into my painting. And the other thing to keep in mind is, while I do have some raw sienna, which is warm in these washes, they're dominantly cool. So I'm using this cool tone in the shadowed areas to help establish light patterns and again build depth into my composition. So the play of warm against cool, light against dark. I'm continuing with the middle value wash, and this is an area that's on another plane than what I was just painting. It's kind of to the side. It jogs back a little bit and is a little further recessed, and I'll actually be using a little bit of a darker value in this area. But just as I did in these other areas, I'm defining a large shape of value, and it's it's a shape that I want to have pushed back in space as I develop my composition. Here's a good example of mixing the warm and cools. And I've started with the Payne's gray, then I brought in some raw sienna, and this is one continual wash, and it's wet. I'm working wet on dry, but as I apply the paint and put my brush back into it, I'm begin working wet and wet at points. But because it's being handled as one wash and I'm leading it down my paper, keep in mind I'm working at an angle, so I'm leading the speed of water down my page, and I get this nice gradation of warm and cool going on, so it picks up some reflection of light by working it as one continual wash. Here again, I'll point out, while there's a door here and there's a window and there's molding that goes around them, none of that concerns me right now. I'm just concerned with painting a middle value shape. Here I'm continuing with another middle value shape, and this is an exterior wall, and it's not underneath the porch like the other two areas. So one of the things I'm doing, while I still have a middle value, it's still in shadow, I'm going to have more of a warm dominance to it than a cool dominance, such as I did in the other areas. And once these areas are dry, there's certain areas I will be coming back over with additional washes. Now everything I've done so far has been completely dried with a hairdryer, and now I'm coming in with more middle value washes, and I'm catching the area underneath the gutter, which is in shadow, and even coming down the pole. Some of those areas are in shadow, but some of the areas are sunlit. So this is where I'm going to start to establish some of those areas that are sunlit, and the mixture I'm using has a little bit of cobalt blue in it. It's a bluer tone, middle value tone that I'm using, and I just feel that it's farther out in the light. While it's in shadow, it's still in an area where kind of the sunlight is hitting, and the shadow just feels bluer to me than the area, say, underneath the porch, which is a little more neutral in color. I'm painting another area here that's in shadow, and it's underneath the gutter, and it's a little further back and away from sunlit areas than the area to the left that I just painted, so I'm painting it with a more neutral tone than what I did to the left, where I used a bluer tone. And this is a continued play of dark against light, warm against cool, neutral against more chromatic mixtures, and just using those to help you develop depth and dimension in your painting. I'm painting a neutral middle value here in underneath the roof here above the gutter, and it's kind of like one large shape, but it's broken up by some of the straps that hang the gutter. So for the most part, I've used a middle value wash to define where the lights and whites are going to be on the building structure, and now I'm going to continue on painting the areas of shrubs, the greenery, the weeds that have grown up on the building, and the lawn that's in front of the structure. So to do that, once again, I'm using a middle value wash, and I'm using a mixture of sap green with a little bit of pyro red in it and some raw sienna. And there'll be some variation in the color mixture that I'm putting down, but for the most part, it's a middle value wash. And I'm painting a large shape here. I'm not trying to paint individual blades of grass or limbs on a shrub or anything right now. I'm just trying to establish this area as a big shape. As I apply this wash, it's important that I treat it as one big shape and one continual wash. I want to keep the leading edge of the wash loaded with moisture so that it doesn't set a hard edge on me. If I don't keep a bead of water on that leading edge, it's going to start to dry, and I'm going to get unwanted hard edges within this shape, which I don't want right now. I want this just to be one large shape painted with a even wash. So once again, I'll mention that I'm working at an angle here, about a 15 to 20 degree angle, and I'm letting the paint flow down the page, and that's the way I'm leading it. Although there's times where I'll start below and I'll bring it up to the wash. It's all the edges of my wash at this point are loaded with water, and they're wet enough they won't set an edge until I get down here and get this completely filled in. Now that I have it completely filled in, it's still very wet, and I'm going to come in with a little bit of a darker valued green and a mixture that has more green content to it, and start working with some wet and wet brushwork. So this is going to give me some variation, some soft edge variation of color and value within this shape. Here again, I'll stress, I'm not trying to paint pieces of grass and sticks and twigs. This is still a big shape that I'm trying to get some gradation of color and value in, and I'm still thinking large shape. At this point, I've put in my middle value washes to help establish the pattern of light moving through my composition. And I'm going to begin working on some darker valued shapes that start to define some of the features of the structure. I'm working with Payne's gray with some burnt sienna and raw sienna in the mixture. And I'm just starting to define some of these window shapes. I've described the window and the door to the left, and now I'm beginning to use a darker value again to describe the panes of glass in this other window. And I know I use the word shapes a lot, but that's how I view this. And if you look at the photograph to the right, you can see now how the middle value shapes in combination with the darker value shapes that I'm putting in, I'm starting to further describe the subject. But I'm thinking about it in terms of shape, not necessarily a window or a roof or a wall. I just think about it as different valued shapes, and I also think about the warm and the cool colors that I'm using. The lower part of this window has been boarded up with plywood or some type of wood panel, so I'm going to use a mixture of burnt sienna with a little bit of raw sienna to describe that wood tone shape that represents that piece of board in the window. I've come across the front of this building painting a variety of windows and doors here pretty much by just painting dark valued rectangles, and often I would break these shapes up and have some more interest in them, the shapes themselves, such as reflection, but some level of activity just to create interest. But in this instance, I want these to feel like they're back in shadow, and they won't have a lot of details. I don't want that detail to make them stand out. I want them to feel like they're back in shadow, so they wouldn't have a lot of that detail and activity. This overhang is supported by these little short spindles that are between the roof and the decorative molding, and I'm trying to describe now with a dark value the space in between these spindles. So I'm working on the negative edges of those, working in negative space, and that's part of that back wall, which is all in shadow. So I'm coming across describing that negative area in between these spindles. Now I'm coming back with a similar valued wash here, and I'm painting that shape that makes up the back wall underneath this porch. So it's a continuation of the negative space that's between those spindles, and I'm working off the negative edge of this the molding here along the porch. So this is Payne's gray that I'm putting a wash on. And so this is a darker value than what I initially put on. So I want that to feel like it's definitely back in shadow and set back in space. I'm going to take a deeper valued, cooler wash and put over the top of this shape that I painted earlier, to just as I did to the right, to make that feel like it's set further back in space more than what it has been showing. And I'm going to use clear water here as I get to the bottom. I want a little bit more of that to feel not so deep in shadow. The area to the right, I have that whole shape feeling very deep in shadow, but on these two areas here, I want to pick up a little bit of a reflection of light. So as I take that wash closer to the bottom, I'm bringing in some clear water so that it's not such a flat wash that's going over the whole thing. To the right, I really wanted that to feel deep under in shadow underneath that overhang, but this is picking up a little bit of reflection of light and help draw the viewer over to that area of the painting. Here I'm going to do some brush work using a dark value, using a small general purpose sable brush again. And I'm starting to describe some of the smaller shapes to build some detail into my composition. I'm going to finish painting this part of the door, which I didn't complete yet. Here I'm doing some darker value brushwork on top of some dark values here, and I am building some variation into these dark shapes, but they're very subtle because it's dark on dark value. So it's not as pronounced as I might do in some instances where I'll have very light shapes reflecting within these. So this is just some very dark valued brushwork to give subtle suggestions that there's some activity going on there. There's other shapes, but it's very subtle because it's all in deep shadow. I'm going to do some brushwork on the right side here on this exterior wall, and I'm using a warmer mixture here, and it's light value, but it's building up another layer on top of what I had there. And I'm trying to contour some of the shapes that are happening within the larger shape of the wall. So there's boards going across, and there's little pieces of shadow that hit it. I'm not trying to over render what's there, but just give some variation of warm and cool and light and dark, still a middle value, but to describe some of the boards there and the contours of that particular plane of the wall. Coming in with a warm tone here to indicate the molding that's around the window. So early on when I was working with these areas, I was just concerned with the overall larger shape, and now I'm coming back and doing some brush work to further describe what's going on there. I'm doing similar brushwork on the door to describe some of the features of what's happening here, the molding around the door, and I'm not varying the value much. This is a very dark middle value area, but I am using some warm and cool variation to help indicate changes in surface or different shapes. That way it allows me to keep the values very close and keep everything in shadow. To this point, I've used shape to describe my subject, and now I'm starting to do some brushwork that's more linear in nature. So I'm starting to use some line to describe what's going on with the subject. I'm taking that darker value along the left side here to describe that space between the roof and the gutter. I'm going to carry that dark value into some other areas of my painting to add some detail and further define some of the features on a building and on the greenery. So I'm just doing a little bit of line work there on the door, and now I'm coming in to give the suggestion of that dark valued shadowed area around the greenery that's growing up on this structure. I'm going to continue with a variety of this dark valued brushwork to add some level of detail to the features of the building here. It doesn't take a lot sometimes when you're coming in with a darker value to describe an area. You don't have to overdo it. Just a few touches, a few linear marks or a few dots or dashes can go a long way in helping describe the edge of shapes. And you can see here just very little touches of value here starts to add a little detail to some of these architectural features. There's a window at the top here on this wall that's still in shadow. So I'm painting it just as I did the other windows, just with a very dark value. And from there I'm going to continue on with some brushwork using a dark value. Just little touches of value start to bring another level of detail. The metal on this roof is kind of a corrugated metal, so I'm just putting some little touches of a dark value there to give that suggestion of that corrugated edge. I'm doing some brushwork with a darker value here on the underside and side of the porch, which is in sunlight, so that darker value is going to make that area more pronounced. While the rooftop to the right is going to remain very light, it's still going to have some variation of warm and cool and a little bit of color to it. So I'm taking a wash brush, a silver black velvet jumbo round small that I like to use, and I'm going to put some warm and cool tones down. And here, think about when you put a brush stroke down, you want to try and accomplish as much as possible. Here, I'm paying attention to the direction in which I'm applying this paint, because it's helping to describe the contour of the surface. It's helping to show that downward slant of the roof. So my brush stroke is kind of following the perspective of that roof, and it's actually a corrugated roof. So it has the rippled surface, and I try to take advantage of my brush strokes to help further describe the direction of that roof and the linear characteristics of the corrugation. I'm doing similar brushwork here on the other roof, and I want it to feel sunlit, so I'm using a very warm tone. I'm going to use line again to further describe what's going on with this roof. And it's not going to take a lot. It's just a little bit of brushwork in the right places is enough to suggest the surface of the roof, and you can get a feeling of the panels that make up this roof just by a little bit of linear brushwork. And I'm taking some burnt sienna, and I'm just doing some brushwork to give the suggestion of a little bit of rust on some elements of the building. There's strips of metal here that support the gutter, and they've got a bit of rust on them, so I'm taking some more of the burnt sienna and just touching that tone to that area to give it more of the feeling of a rusty feel. Just a little bit of brushwork here and there. Now I'm taking a dark middle value, and I've got a quill brush here that I use for detail work, and I'm using line to describe the characteristics of the boards of the wall. And you can see that I don't just draw a straight line all the way across. I make a variety of marks. Some are dots, some are lines, but I try to vary the size, the length of them, and the placement of them. I don't want them to all be the same. I don't want it to look like a sheet of notebook paper here on the side of the house. So I break up those lines to help provide interest and variation. And I'm going to take my brush here and continue some of the linear marks to give the suggestion of boards. And again, I don't have to paint every board, and I don't have to outline every board. It's just broken up linear suggestions that there's boards there. And as I mentioned, the roof is made out of corrugated metal, and much as I did with the boards on the wall, I'm just given the indication using line of the corrugation of the roof, and I'm not trying to draw a line for every corrugation of the rooftop. I'm just giving the suggestion of that pattern, that activity, to make it feel like it's a corrugated roof, but I don't have to render every little fold in the metal to do that. And I'm going to carry that activity up to this other rooftop because it's also a corrugated roof. So I've got a light value. In this case, I've got a light gray, and I don't have to dip my brush very much because it'll hold quite a bit, and I'm just after a light value. So I'm not doing every ripple in every panel, it's just giving the suggestion of that linear activity in the roof and the characteristics of it. So I don't have to show every little line. And again, I vary the length and the placement of the marks that I'm making. I want a few of these areas to be a little bit more defined, so I'm doing some darker valued brushwork, especially at places where shapes intersect. You can see here by starting that dark value on the edge of the molding on the window, it helps further describe that molding. So I'm working on the negative edge of that to further define that window. Now I'm starting to work on the greenery that's around the building. So I'm got a mixture of sap green and pyrrole red, and I'm going over top of some of the area that I've already applied a wash. And I'm not trying to render the greenery around this structure. My interest lies in the building more than it does the greenery. So I'm going to intentionally simplify a lot of what's going on here, but I am going to do some brushwork to show changes in value. I'm treating these more as larger shapes of foliage than I am individual plants per se, or an individual bush. So I'm making brush marks that give the suggestion that there's leaves there, but I'm not trying to paint each individual leaf. I'm not going to render the greenery on this composition. This area right here is set back under the overhanging shadow, so it's a much darker value, but it has just a little bit of a lighter green coming through. And as I start to work more in the foreground here, I'm trying to describe volume and of the shape, and not so much what's going on with the individual plant in terms of branches or twigs and individual leaves. So I'm doing a lot of simplification here because I don't want the focus on my composition to be the greenery that's around this. In fact, I'm going to oversimplify it, and not just am I going to simplify it, but I'm going to keep the values a very light middle value. I mentioned earlier how I was going to be using value placement and warm and cool colors to help define space. And you can see that the placement of the darker values in my composition are in the middle ground. They're around this building and on this building. And if you look at the foreground, it's very simple. It's a large shape. I don't have a lot of detail in it. I'm going to build some more variation of value in it, but there's not going to be a lot of hard edges in it. So I start to create spatial relationships and start to define foreground, middle ground, and not so much background in this painting because of the composition. It's a very close-up view, but my darker values and harder edges are in middle ground, and as are the cooler colors. And as you start to come into the foreground, it's simplified quite a bit. It's a warmer tone, it's a lighter value. So I'm using that light value, that warmer tone in the soft edges to help it feel more like it's in the foreground, and then the building is in the middle ground, because I don't want this to look like a flat composition, which it could easily happen given the subject and the composition. So I'm working with a little bit of a darker valued green here, and again, I'm just simplifying. I'm giving the suggestions of shape, volume, giving the suggestion of direction by my brush strokes. So you can see on the ground there, some of my brush strokes are more linear, and this is one large shape, but you know that there's a ground there, and there's a bush, and there's something climbing, but it's not overly described. It's very subtle in the suggestion of what that activity is. I want to set this area back more than what it is, so I'm going to come over it again with another cool wash that's a little darker value, and work to make this feel like it's set back a little further than what it feels right now, a little bit more in shadow. I'm going to do the same in these other areas to a lesser degree than what I did to the right. So a little darker towards the top, but not so much towards the bottom, coming in with clear water in my wash. And I'm going to do the same in this shape. So a little bit of a darker middle value, and then come in with some clear water and gradate that down. little bit more brushwork to crisp up some edges and further define a few shapes. I like to do this towards the end of my painting. I have a process that I definitely follow, and I often start with the larger washes, and little by little I work down in shape and value. So right now, just trying to further define some of the edges here on some of these shapes and make them a little bit more pronounced in areas, and just create some marks that give some interest in some of these areas. I want this sunlit area of the post here to be a little more pronounced, so I'm coming in with a darker valued wash here that's leaning more towards the blue side, and I'm going to bring that down in the shadowed areas along these posts to make that sunlit area of the post a little bit more pronounced. So I'm just coming down with that kind of a middle value blue tone that I have. So it's my Payne's gray with a little bit of cobalt blue in it. And that's my painting, Farmhouse number 2. As you look at this painting and think about some of the things I covered in the video, early on I talked about one of the challenges was to keep this from becoming a flat painting, a flat looking composition, and how value placement and the use of warm and cool colors would be key to the success of that. So if you look at this, you can see how my dark to middle dark values are in the middle ground, and I have my light middle values in the foreground. So my dark values are isolated to that middle ground. I've also used warm and cool colors in various areas. The shadowed areas are very cool dominant, and this area in the foreground, which would be sunlit, is a warm dominance. In addition to the value placement and the warm and cool colors, I've also paid attention to my placement of soft and hard edges. The majority of hard edges appear in the middle ground, and the foreground are soft edges. There's less detail in the foreground, more detail in the middle ground. All these things help create spatial relationships in my composition. Think about how I used both shape and line to describe my subject. And don't forget about direction. Think about how you can use the direction of your brushstroke to help further define your subject. I'll use the greenery in this example. I painted a large shape, and at the end I came in with a bit of a darker value and started to describe the greenery growing up the building and the bushes and what represents the lawn. And I changed the direction of my brush strokes. I used one type of brush stroke to define the shape of the bushes, and then when it came to the lawn, I made some linear marks. And if you look at the lower right hand corner, I have a very distinct horizontal linear brush stroke that I made it and left alone, and it's enough to describe that area as a flat plane. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Be sure to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And if you have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page on my website, rsurowitzart.com. And if you have questions, you can always email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.